We've made this point before, and we use the example. For example, if somebody came along and says Jesus is a bigot, like the guy on TikTok recently, that weird pastor dude, that pastor I put in air quotes there, who comes out and says Jesus was a bigot. He didn't love women really, and he didn't really treat women fairly. He had to repent of that kind of thing, right? And so you got people come out and say Jesus is a bigot, right? Now there's three ways that you could deal with that kind of statement. You could either come along and say, well, yeah, Jesus was a bigot, but because he's Jesus, it's okay because Jesus is God and whatever Jesus does is right. And so, yeah, he was a bigot, but because it's Jesus, it's okay for him to be a bigot. You could come at that argument, okay? You could come at the argument and say, oh, Jesus was a bigot, therefore Jesus wasn't God, and I shouldn't worship him, and he's a bad person. So you could either come to that conclusion, which is probably what an atheist might do, is if he were to hear that. He would say, oh, yeah, Jesus was a bigot, and I want to reject Jesus now, okay? Or the third argument is to say Jesus wasn't a bigot, which is most of us, right? We would say, no, Jesus is not a bigot. That's just wrong. Jesus is good, and he's not a bigot, right? So that's the three ways to approach that false claim about Jesus. Well, in the same way, you can have a false claim about God. You could say God decrees all moral evil, okay? And you could either take the Calvinist approach and say, yes, that's true, God does do that, but he's God and he can do what he wants, and therefore it's right. And so he does wrong things seemingly to us, but he's really right in doing it, and it's just a mystery beyond our full comprehension. We don't know really how it's true, as John Calvin himself actually makes the argument, as we've read thousands of times here before, from John Calvin, how it was ordained by the foreknowledge and decree of God what man's future was, without God being implicated as an associate in the fault as the author and the prover of transgression, is a secret so much excelling the inside of the human mind that I'm not ashamed to confess ignorance. I daily so meditate on these mysteries of his judgments that curiosity to know anything more does not attract me. What's he saying? I don't know how God's good. I don't know how his character is right and good given determinism. I just don't know how it's true. But he's taking that first approach. He's accepting, yes, God decrees moral evil. And I don't know how that works, but it's just true. But he's still good because God's good and you can't call God bad. So he's doing seemingly bad things from our perspective, but we know he's good. And that's the approach they're taking. What the atheist is doing is they're also accepting this claim. God decrees moral bad stuff, and therefore I don't believe in God, or I don't worship God, one of the two. And that's obviously the bad approach. The rest of Christianity, what are we doing? The rest of Christianity is doing the same thing whenever the person says Jesus was a bigot. We're coming along and saying, no, Jesus wasn't a bigot. Or we're doing the same thing. When people say God decrees moral evil, we're coming along and go, no, you're wrong. You misinterpreted the Bible. God doesn't decree moral evil. So you can choose which of those three methodologies you want to take when confronted with what people are saying about God. You can either say, yes, that's true about God, but he's still good and we just don't know how he's good. Or you can do what the atheist says and says, oh, God is decreeing more evil, therefore he's bad, and so we're going to reject God. Or you can come along with the rest of us and say God doesn't decree moral evil. You've got to decide which of those three approaches you're wanting to take, because that's really where it gets down to your theodicy, as we're talking about.
Well, I do whatever I was determined to do. Leighton, honestly, I think some people think that every time that Leighton Flowers does I've been determined to not understand these things, that he's just trying to be funny. No, that is how he thinks. It's
not how I think. It's what you believe. And prove me wrong, Dr. White. Prove me wrong. Come on the program and say, I do not believe that Leighton was determined to believe what he believes. Come out and just say that. Because otherwise, you're not mocking me. You're mocking the true claim of your system. Now, lest you just think that I'm misrepresenting Calvinist. Remember, James White touted the book by Bignon, the French philosopher. He touted his book as a defense of determinism, right? You've heard him on his program. You've seen it all over social media, this French philosopher, Bignon, being touted as one of the leading scholars in defense of this concept of theistic determinism. And let's just, instead of believing me, listen to what one of their leading scholars says with regard to what Leighton has been determined to believe and think. Okay, listen.
Exhaustively describe reality. Okay. So determinism isn't the thesis that some things are determined. It's the view that all things are determined. And we'll get back to that because that matters in some of the formulation of the arguments.
Okay, well, this raises a question then. So did God causally determine Calvinists like Kokel, Christ, Muller, etc., to disagree with you?
The answer is yes. All things are determined. So yes, God did causally.
Okay, so the Calvinists that disagree with theistic determinism, in other words, there are some Calvinists who believe in libertarian free will, like Crisp and others, inconsistently, but they do. They deny theistic determinism, and they disagree with the higher Calvinists who do believe in theistic determinism, and he asks them, did God determine them to do that? And he says, yes, that's exactly what happens. All right?
Determine that.
Okay, and it also raises another question. Leighton, you and I both used to be Calvinists, they say, right? They claim to be Calvinists.
Yeah, that's fine. And I can take that as their word. I didn't know them. I don't have any reason to doubt that they were sincere Calvinists in the past. But yes, to answer that question, again, he's asking, well, that raises a big question, a conundrum somehow for the Calvinists. Did God determine us to leave Calvinism? And yes, I take them at their word. I say, yes, God determined that too. Determinism means all is determined. So just get this out of the way. Determinism means that everything is determined.
So it makes no sense to ask, well, did God determine that? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
The answer is yes.
Okay, so not from me. That's from the leading scholar of the Calvinistic system. God is determined for Leighton Flowers to leave determinism and to believe what I believe. So he's laughing at and mocking what he himself believes and his leading scholars teach and believe. The namesake for their own systematic even believes these things. Let me pull it up on the screen if we have time to do this real quick. I know many of you have seen these things. There's nothing new here under the sun from what we've done, but I just have to point these things out because new people are tuning in every time we have a program, especially when we're answering someone like James White. Creatures are so governed, according to John Calvin, by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what he has knowingly and willingly decreed. In other words, God decreed Leighton's view against determinism, period. That's just a truism of their view. He's mocking it. He's mocking me saying something that's true about his system. Just keep that in mind. John Calvin, quote, "We hold that God is the disposer and ruler of all things, that from the remotest eternity, according to his own wisdom, he decreed what he was to do, and now by his power execute what he decreed. Hence, we maintain that by his providence, not heaven and earth and inanimate creatures only, but also the counsels and wills of men are so governed as to move exactly in the course which he has destined." In other words, he has destined the will of men, the will to do good or to do evil, to molest, to rape, to do all those things. That is in accordance with his divine will. Thieves, murderers, rapists, molesters, everything. According to John Calvin, quote, "Other evildoers are instruments of divine providence, being employed by the Lord himself to execute judgments which he is resolved to inflict." Now, again, maybe this is not the James White kind of Calvinism. Maybe James White has softened John Calvin's Calvinism, or Bignon, maybe he's overstating his case. Maybe God doesn't really decree and determine for molesters to molest or rapists to rape on James White's form of Calvinism. Well, let's see.
When a child is raped, is God responsible, and did he decree that rape?
If he didn't, then that rape is an element of meaningless evil that has no purpose. What I'm trying to point out by going to Scripture...
So what is your answer there? Because I want to understand the answer to that question.
I'm trying to go to Scripture to answer.
Yes, but what is the answer to the question that he just asked so that we can understand what the answer is?
I mentioned to him, yes, because if not, then it's meaningless and purposeless, and though God knew it was going to happen, he created without a purpose. That means God brought the evil into existence. No, it was going to exist, but for no purpose, no redemption, nothing positive, nothing good.
So he did decree it, and if he decreed it, then there's meaning to it.
It has meaning, it has purpose.
Got it.
Suffering, all suffering has purpose. Everything in this world has purpose. There is no basis for despair. But if we believe that God created knowing all this was going to happen, but with no decree, he just created, and all this evil's out there and there's no purpose, then every rape, every situation like that is nothing but purposeless evil, and God is responsible for the creation of despair. And that is not what I believe.
For years I've been trying to figure out why it is that in order for rape to exist, Or unless God caused it to happen, there can't be any purpose in it. God can use evil, and he does. But to blame God, which is what a decree does, to blame God for the rape of a child is a horrible attack on the very character and the love of God.
Okay, so you heard it for yourself. James White and Calvinism qua Calvinism, according to the namesake and the leading proponents, believe God determines all desires of evil, all moral evil, all heinous evil. That is the claim of their system, period. So when somebody asks me, Leighton, why did you determine this? And I say, if Calvinism is true, the reason I determine this is because God determined for me to, and you laugh at it and you mock it, then what are you mocking except the claim of your own system? You're ultimately calling determinism a joke. That's what you're doing. Whether you recognize you're doing it or not, you're mocking your own view. This is why I often say sometimes some arguments don't need to be refuted. They just need to be clearly stated, because intuitively we know they're funny. We know they're jokes. They're silly. They're untenable. That's the reason I keep stating them. I keep stating what you find to be so detestable and so weird and oh my goodness, that's so good. Why do I state it? Because it's the claim of your system, and it's revealing it how asinine it is. And whenever I state it and you laugh at it, instead of doing what Bignon did, which is, oh yeah, that's true. Let's just move past that now because yeah, that's true. Why don't all Calvinists just respond the way Bignon did and just say, yes, it's true. You rejected Calvinism and you started a podcast because God determined for you to. Okay? And then we can talk about why you think God might do that. And you can also talk about why you think I'm still blameworthy for my actions in doing this when God determined for me to do it. And we can talk about that. And I think that would be a reasonable discussion then versus what I think we see James White doing here, mocking his own system.
Well, that's true, though. Like, I mean, if you think if determinism is true, then I'm only going to do what God determined me to do. So I
mean, would you be logically consistent if you concluded that God is therefore somehow morally compromised because of determinism?
Okay. So if determinism is true, let's just pretend determinism is true.
Yeah, which I am 100% on board with you. It's not true. Yeah, it's not accurate.
But again, my brain is trying to work around this because obviously if determinism is true, I'm only going to determine what God has determined for me to determine. But
see, that's all he's got.
Okay. It's the claim of your system. I'm just stating the claim of your system because he's asking me why would I do this? Well, the ultimate reason why I would determine my choice would be on determinism is because God determined it. That's just a fact of the matter. Now what he's trying to get me to answer is, could I logically conclude that while determinism is true, God is still morally good? That's what he's trying to get me to conclude, which I already reflected on earlier with regard to Roger Olson's perspective, that if I came to the conclusion that the Calvinism's version of determinism is true, I would have to conclude, as Roger Olson said, that God is monstrous, that God is immoral under that view. Logically, I would have to come to that conclusion because that's the logic of it. Now, I could deny logic. In other words, I could say, well, it doesn't matter what my logic says. I'm gonna just deny logic. I'm just going to accept the antinomy. I'm going to accept the paradox. I'm going to accept the very quote that we gave from John Calvin. I'm just going to stop meditating on it and just accept the multi-orbed perspective. God determines pride, lust, and molestations, but God is good. And just accept it. The three quandaries of Jesus is a bigot, but because Jesus is a bigot, it's Jesus, and Jesus is the one who defines what's good and bad, and so you can't call him bad. So yeah, he's a bigot, but he's still good, and we just don't understand how he can be a good bigot. But he's a married bachelor, or whatever it is. It's just this logical contradiction. Instead of just going, no, Jesus isn't a bigot. Okay, God determines evil, but he's good. God decrees evil, all moral evil, but he's still good. And we just accept it. And if you don't accept it, then you don't accept our moral order. And instead of just going in and go, no, God doesn't decree moral evil. You've got that wrong. And that's what we're trying to push back on. That's why we're having this discussion.
That is honestly, a lot of people think it's just a joke because it is a joke. But no, that is.
Determinism is a joke. Correct. Mark it down, ladies and gentlemen.